welcome to today's BCS Policy Jam on should TikTok be banned. So just thought I'd give a bit of context to this session. So back in 2017, China passed its national intelligence law to strengthen its national information and security infrastructures. So these changes changed things fundamentally at a geopolitical and international business level. Just for a bit of context, the most controversial sections of the law include Article 7, which potentially compels businesses registered or operating in China to hand over information to Chinese intelligence agencies, such as the Ministry of State Security, and to conceal the fact that they do so. And Article 10 makes the law applicable outside China, having implications for Chinese businesses operating overseas, with specific issues around technology. Technology companies potentially compelling them to hand over user data, even when operating in foreign jurisdictions. So interestingly, in 2020, the Trump administration attempted to ban TikTok in the US. But at the time, this was widely seen as kind of red meat to China hawks in America and in the Republican Party, and ultimately that was not a successful policy. However, since then, the mood has changed, and support for further restrictions on TikTok has become more bipartisan, sorry. Although serious divides have emerged, claims of xenophobia, claims of hypocrisy, as the real motivations, people are considering those as the real motivations behind TikTok restrictions. What we do notice is lots of noise about TikTok and its future across the West. However, clear public communications are sometimes quite difficult to access, especially at scale. So it's difficult for people to discern fact from fiction and rumor and misinformation. And why is it so controversial to policymakers? We're also interested in the fact that with elections in the offing in both the UK and the United States, do any political party want to alienate younger voters by banning TikTok, a platform which is almost ubiquitous amongst certain age groups and younger voters, many devoted to the app? So how do policymakers deliver a balance, and is there a balance to be had? Is the problem espionage and national security? Is it impact on mental health? Is it algorithmically manufactured addiction? Or all of the above, or none at all? So yeah, we've got a lot to get through today. The normal format of this is that I will hand over to Rashik, who is our Chief Executive, and he can give our roundup of his thinking and what's been his priorities over the past couple of weeks. And then I will go into allow each individual to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some questions. Fantastic. Rashik, over to you.
Yeah, so Dan, my priorities over the last few weeks has really been on quantum. I was at the quantum session last week, and Adam was there as well, because I see quantum suddenly becoming very relevant to our community and opens up lots of interesting topics. So we'll come back to quantum later, I think, Dan, in a later topic. On the specific one here about TikTok, there's obviously a lot of conversation around AI and the safeguarding, and should ChatGPT be allowed? And we saw Italy make a move to ban ChatGPT. That's a fascinating turn of events, I think. But the point of view, and Adam and the FTAG are pulling together a kind of BCS point of view on that, which is fascinating. For me, I think there is a lot of work to be done around creating the right guardrails for social media in general. And I would put TikTok into the same bucket as other social media. Yeah, sure, there's a specific thing, which is the ownership of the TikTok being from China. But is that really that different from ownership of the US companies? When I think about what happened with Cambridge Analytica, TikTok haven't done anything yet, but you've seen some of the existing companies have. And so should we be considering them in the same bucket? Well, how do we kind of think through that? So there's lots of open questions here. I don't have any answers, but I think it's a broader and more interesting topic when you widen it to all of social media, not just TikTok.
Thanks, Rashik. Okay, Adam, can I come to you to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Adam Leon Smith. I'm chair of the Fellows Technical Advisory Group. So as Rashik said, we've been working on a position on what's going on in AI. But I'm also here today to kind of represent my personal position around not just TikTok, but digital sovereignty of tech as a topic.
Thanks, Adam. Alexei, can we come to you?
Yeah, so my name's Dr. Alexei Drew. I'm a recently lapsed academic or recovering academic, whichever term you want to take. Lapsed by way of the RAND Corporation think tank consultancy. And then after that, I've moved on to the International Committee of the Red Cross, where I'm the technology policy advisor in the London delegation. Bit of proviso, I'm here today in my academic capacity, not representing the position of the ICRC. It's a boring proviso, but unfortunately these days I have to be careful. And that's me in a nutshell.
Thanks, Alexei. Casey?
Hi, nice to be here today. I'm Casey Callista. I'm the lead public affairs consultant for the technology sector at Hill & Knowlton Strategies. I also am involved in some of the Labour Party's digital policy making as part of Labour Digital. I'm also voluntary policy advisor for Glitch, which is the UK's first digital citizenship charity, and really focuses on combating harms, particularly against women and minorized communities online and from social media. Have to say the same thing, speaking more in a personal capacity. I'm not representing any of my clients.
Fantastic. Rashik, I think you've introduced yourself. Is there anything else that you wanted to say, or are you okay?
I'm okay, we can move on.
Brilliant. Okay, so first question is, the title for this this session: should TikTok be banned? I feel it's only fair to go to Rashik first as the BCS chief exec.
I think
I get the sap now.
yeah. So I think TikTok in certain places is not an appropriate tool to be using. If you're a government advisor, then I would agree that it's not appropriate. Is there an issue with young people using it? I don't think so. There are cases where that wouldn't be appropriate. I don't think a wholesale ban on TikTok's appropriate, but we need to be careful where we use it and how we use it, like we would with any other social media. Should we be extra careful because of Chinese connection? Maybe, if you think of that as a risk. There's always a risk of inappropriate access to your data, and where does that take you? I think that's a conversation we need to really think through.
Thanks, Rashik. Alexei?
Yeah, I kind of align myself similarly with Rashik, that there are a lot of, coming back to your initial point, your framing section, Dan, as is it a national security issue? Is it a privacy issue? Is it a data sovereignty issue? Is it what's the impact upon democratic values and democratic activities? The simple but not simple answer is all of the above, right? But in terms of whether the blunt instrument of a ban is the most appropriate response, I would say no, for a number of reasons, but I think the most prominent of those is the geopolitical, is that, as noted, it is very hard to go and use that blunt instrument without, in many cases, quite fair critique for the response. I think there are more nuanced ways of dealing with the problems across these different aspects that will simultaneously mitigate these different types of risk and also potentially navigate that geopolitical conundrum of, if you do this, is this simply xenophobia writ into tech policy? So I would say that the outright ban, not the right response. There is a better way to do it that actually does mitigate all those different types of issues and risks.
Thanks, Alexei. Adam?
No, I don't think it should be banned. So first of all, as I think everyone already is dividing in their minds, there's two issues. There's my location on my data on my phone is relevant to national security. Should I have an app on my phone that's potentially sending data to a state that may or may not be allied? That's not a tech issue, really. That's an issue of national security and a very small amount of people that should be responsible and trained to understand that kind of thing. The other side of things, which is more about the systemic impact of the social media, and particularly the machine learning recommendation engines within the online platform, that's an issue that is, as someone just said, more nuanced than that. There are better ways to manage those kind of systemic risks than a ban. And we can learn a lot from other jurisdictions and how other countries are starting to look at doing that as well.
Thank you. And Casey?
Well, you invited an American onto a panel, so I almost feel somewhat compelled to represent, a more strong point of view. But obviously it's very nuanced. So sorry to disappoint you, Dan, but I loved the way that you posed the question. Love a provocative question. To bring in 2 points that I think add to what has already been said. Rashik, you mentioned in your opening statements that TikTok hasn't done any harms yet. But actually, I think they've done a huge amount of harm on our society, particularly on our young people. And speaking as a stepmother, I've been able to see that happen. I don't want to be a hypocrite. I am on TikTok as a lurker. And that has really helped me know what the conversation is that's happening on that platform, so I can better fulfill my duty safeguarding, 2 young minds. And my 15-year-old stepson knew who Andrew Tate was before I did. And I'm very on top of this stuff. So the reality of incel culture and the way that these things are being fed to people is happening now. And it's really scary. And we have a role, and government and us as a society have serious questions that we need to answer, and we need to figure out how to limit some of these harms better than we're doing now. And this feeds into my second point that I want to make, is about digital regulation. I know, sexy topic, but anyone who's heard me speak on anything recently knows that this is the thing that I think a lot of what's happening in our society comes back to, and it's such an important topic. So I won't go too far into it, apart to say, pick up on some of the points that Alexi has made, is that when we take a step back and think about geopolitics, we know particularly for tech policy, we're likely moving towards more and more divergent systems of digital regulation. I think that's something we need to take into account when we have this discussion, particularly because we're seeing how, with some of the proposals from the European Union, and seeing how sometimes some of these ways of approaching regulation are differing, so that it is going to be very based on values. And so I'll leave it there, since Adam now wants to hopefully disagree with me on something.
I think Alexi had her hand up first, and then Adam. So Alexi, you go.
It's not quite a disagreement. I think it's a taking into account one of the things that was said just a couple of minutes ago, is that I'm also a lurker on TikTok. I don't use it, but people keep sending me links on it. And so I decided that I had to stop trying to open the app in a web browser, and it got very annoying. But what I would say from having, I'm one of those people on the cusp of the digital generation, right? I'm 34, but I grew up with the sound of the dial tone. These mediums of having people, having your information sources change by generation is not new. We've already mentioned that, and I don't disagree about the type of harm that these platforms can do, particularly when unregulated and not understood by the generation above who are responsible for how these minds and people, younger people, interact with it. But this has happened with almost every platform that's come about. MSN Messenger and the ability to access and talk to people on the internet without an understanding of where they are from or who they actually are. Facebook or Meta, Twitter, Vine, which is really the precursor to TikTok if we're going there. Like, these platforms have always done this. I think what that tells us is not that we shouldn't do something, it's the fact that actually there's not that much new here. There is a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of actually doing better governance structures and strategy, and education and structures and strategy, that would mean that there are the tools available for parents and mentors, and there are tools available for governments to ensure that these harms are not transferred from one generation to another when a new platform appears. Otherwise, we have a very whack-a-mole approach to, here's a new platform, we need to regulate it this way. What we should be doing is looking for more systemic means of having governance and education structures which are applicable as these new platforms arrive, not after the fact. Because that also creates this lag and delay, which means we're now trying to tell 11 to 18-year-olds that they can't have a platform that they've become used to. The other point I'd say is that I actually think we're not quite at the point of governance divergence. I think we're at the point where we could see a joint direction in global governance around these sorts of technologies. And I say this based on the fact that finally, the US is waking up to the need for data privacy and data ownership laws. Now, the EU has been doing it for a while, but the fact that we're now seeing a growth of understanding of the requirement for this is an opportunity for us to actually come together and standardize better and actually work together on single standards rather than these divergent standards. Now, I'm perhaps being a bit optimistic whether that's going to occur, particularly when you take into the very different government structures. But it's not impossible, and I'm going to cling to that optimism for as long as I can. But that's my point.
Thanks. Adam?
Okay, so I do a lot of work in standardization in one particular area that's being regulated, which is AI. So you read right to a bull in terms of divergence, but it is a massive risk, right? I mean, since the first international telephone calls were being made, we saw that we needed to have technical standardization internationally. And that standardization and the deregulation of things like telecommunications led us to mobile phones, led us to the internet, led us to where we are now, which is our unstoppable innovation is meeting like an immovable object of rights versus values in multiple different areas. But there is a lot of work going on in standardization organizations like ISO IEC. And when I sit there in an international audience and we talk about some of the things you're talking about, Casey, which are quite societal and quite real, you know, there's a big understanding of the difference between implementing some technical best practices, implementing risk management systems and governance processes that are flexible and can work internationally. And, you know, I can happily sit there with people from very different backgrounds internationally and understand how we both might use the same kind of risk management framework with different national values. The other thing is, the reason why I'm still optimistic, apart from all the good work that's going on in standardization, is ultimately we live in a global world. And most companies that are selling technology want to operate in the biggest market possible. So hopefully through meeting the gold standard, companies can continue to trade all over the world. And hopefully that's supported by international technical standards.
Thanks. Casey?
Yeah, no, that's interesting, Adam. I guess I like the points that you made, and obviously I love being an optimist, but there is more than one internet that exists already in the world, and we all know that. And so I think that's a critical part of what we're talking about here. You know, if you go on social media in China right now, it's different than you can see. You can say different things. That's just fact. I don't want to dwell on that though. What I was really interested in some of the points that Alexi made, and I completely agree with all of them except for one part, and that's how you led into it, and that's about how things haven't changed. And I guess in the heart of it, you know, where we go through the same things as society over and over again, but to add in even more nuance to that, it's that things are happening faster and more influential via TikTok than they were on MSN Messenger or in different platforms. And we are, to Adam's point, bringing it all together, we are more global. And there is someone making decisions behind the scenes at each of the different platforms. And I think that feeds into your more general systemic point that we do have to come up with a system of regulation. And one of the things that we need to take into account with that is on who is making the decisions around what is prioritized, what is pushed out, what gets to go viral. We already know with TikTok, since this is the app that the platform that our discussion is focused on, although it does apply to other platforms as well, I'm not singling them out for that particular reason, except for it's the title of the event. We know that they are promoting content in different ways. We know that most of it is commercial, and that's because, you know, they want an influencer to join the app and then bring their big audience with them. So they'll push that content even though it wouldn't have gone viral otherwise. This is out in the public domain. You know, there are a lot of things that go on. So I think there's a really critical point around values, around some of what we're discussing, around who gets to make decisions, who is the policymaker in this space, where's the role for the public. And if I'm going back to close, if we're going to talk about digital regulation, I think Glitch makes this point really well about how they want to see an approach to regulating user-to-user like content generation sites, and that's about having a public health approach, and that takes into account everything from, you know, how are parents like educated, how are we all involved.
Casey, I'm just interested because you're the only American on the panel. Is it? Do you think it's contextually different in the US to the UK in terms of prevalence and impact socially?
I don't think I necessarily am an expert on that. Obviously, we know that feeds are generated based on what you watch and, you know, what you engage with more, sometimes, you know, what you linger on. So there's a large part of that. And I have never seen a difference between when I'm on like, you know, a social media site in the States, or have like started that when I was, you know, younger and was still living there or anything like that. So yeah, I wouldn't say that, but it was more of a very specific, I think, point in case about what about the censorship, if I'm being honest, about that we do know happens.
Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you. Rashik's off mute. Let's go to Rashik quick.
Yeah, so just kind of building up on the points that are being made here. Yeah, when you think about the ways in which the motivation system works here, who are the people who are really influencing this, and where's the kind of motivation coming from? It's all about access to influence, right? You've got this group of social media influencers who are trying to create an audience and attract that audience and deliver what they think the audience wants, and they're getting paid for doing that, and the people are paying are obviously the ones that are driving that influence. So it's actually a very complex web here. Per se, TikTok isn't the only person to blame here. There's many actors in here, and so I think we have to kind of unpack this a little bit and go back and look at where should the regulation really help us, and how would it really help us? You know, just a straightforward ban of TikTok will just mean that influence will go somewhere else, right? So, you know, are other people's algorithms any better or faster at creating the influence than TikTok is? You know, you can see it through Instagram. TikTok is very, very effective. There's no doubt about that. So is Instagram. So are some of the other platforms around the world. So we've got to come back and think about what are we doing with the influence structure and the motivations, and how we're managing that, and how do we put ethics into that part of the conversation, so we can have an understanding of the unintended consequences. We've seen this with the sugar wars back many years ago, right? So when that influence happened and we drove adoption of sugar, you saw what happened with obesity, right? Those kind of pathways of influence that allows people to realize their own financial gains, their commercial gains, isn't necessarily conducive to good society and good for individuals. Whether it's grandchildren, whether it's nieces, nephews, you know, young people, it doesn't matter who it is. It comes back to who are the influencers, and do we understand whether they're being ethical or not at the core of what they're doing? You're on mute, Dan.
See, this is why I never go on mute, because I have not got the skills to unmute myself when I need to. Adam, your go.
So I think it's really interesting to look at what other jurisdictions have tried to do around TikTok and social media. So in the US, you know, they've looked at keeping all of the processing within a separate corporate structure and a separate data center in the United States, right? But it's later been leaked that there's been some level of access back to China, which is exactly the same as the discussions we have about data privacy and hosting things in Amazon or Microsoft or US-owned companies, when there's always somebody remotely in a different state that's got access. And that I don't think that's worked perfectly, but that is something someone's tried. Another thing is the Digital Services Act in Europe, which I think is preferable, which it mandates any online platform that has over 45 million monthly users in the EU to meet a whole range of obligations. And some of these relate to, you know, doing internal risk assessments. Some of them relate to having crisis management processes. They're not that dramatic. A couple of them are, though. One is independent audit of the risk assessment that the online platform has done for the societal impacts they could have and how they could impact people's different rights and values. So Meta, etc., TikTok, all have to produce this risk assessment, get it signed off by a third-party company, but then they have to do a couple of things in their actual platform. One is they have to give access to the back end to trusted researchers to look for new kinds of societal risks or systemic risks in the recommendation engines. And secondly, they have to offer some transparency and explainability to end users to say, you've just been shown this advert because you Googled this yesterday. So really explaining to people why they're being offered particular adverts. So I think it's really interesting what the way different countries are approaching it, and I think we can learn from them.
Alexi, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up from Adam's point there, and one of the comments that I responded to in the chat as to why TikTok and why are we talking about banning it, and having seen that it might do potentially something wrong, not what it has already done. And just to reiterate, I think it's a way around that, or a way to explain that, is that why policy should try and mitigate threats before they are realized, not afterwards. Now, we all know that it very rarely works that way. My previous role was in arms control, and we didn't even manage to control some of the worst arms that we've ever invented in the world until after they've been used. So that, unfortunately, very rarely happens. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And we have now quite an extended history of social media platforms and an understanding of the types of harms they can do, both to national security, to privacy, to democratic values and engagement. So the reasoning here is that I still disagree with the ban, but we should be effectively trying to learn from those lessons to ensure that we can mitigate these risks now. And I think Adam pointing to the DSA is a very good example, because what the DSA has done is effectively looked at some of the things that have caused problems or risks or harms from historic and previous platforms, and come up with ways in which they can be mitigated systemically and applied across the board. For example, the transparency component and the ability to actually see why you're being given a post, that would solve a lot of the issues that we have about in terms of the marketization of public information and how people's data is used as a marketable tool against them to try and influence their behavior financially, but also politically. And that's really important. And we learned that from Cambridge Analytica. We learned that from all sorts of other, these days, influence campaigns for hire. And we realized that actually a way to mitigate that a lot of academic research was done, is to make people aware of why they are being served content and the history of that content. So rather than wait for that to happen again on a new platform, here is an example of a set of governance structures that are targeted quite specifically to types of platform that have a particular level of risk due to their size, and then that they can afford to do these mitigation strategies. So they can't say, we've not got the money. Well, you've got 45 million users in Europe. You definitely do, or have the opportunity to. Therefore, you can and should do this. The problem, as Casey pointed out, is that if we do go down this divergence, or I should say further divergence, because I do believe that the splinter net is well and truly here to stay. The question is, how many canyons forms in this splintered internet? Is it 2? I'd argue we're already at maybe 3 or 4 off the top of my head. But do we become a kind of more of a bayou approach or a river delta? That's not what we want. We want as few of these as possible. So we need to try and hold together the shared tranches of this splintered version of the internet that we occupy, and not compete over standards that are designed to try and actually mitigate significant risks to our communities.
Casey's got a big smile on her face, so I'm just wondering if you want to come in, or...
I always have a smile on my face because I was really enjoying this. This is like what I like to do, so you've picked the right policy geek. No, I enjoyed those points. I also had a chance to read some of the comments. I think there's a really interesting comment about, I can't remember now, but will it be banned? And I think my take on that is, but if it's banned, will it work? So, I mean, one of the funniest things I've done recently is watch TikTok's commentary on the Senate hearings about TikTok. I don't know if anyone is into that, but I definitely recommend it if you're probably here today. And so it's, young people commenting on how stupid policymakers are because they don't understand what the app actually does or how it functions. And that is one of the big challenges that we're facing when we're talking about all of this, that we have to recognize. And it's something that I've specialized in. It's also interesting that we're talking about a communications platform here today because our society is sort of turned this way. It's almost become all about comms. And this is tying in like ChatGPT and how AI is evolving, it's almost like you don't need to be an expert in anything anymore. You just need to know where to look for the information and then be really good at talking about it. I'm connecting a lot of things there, but I guess I'll wrap it up by saying that, going back to Adam's point when he was talking about the divergence and looking across to see what other people are doing, I think one of the interesting things, if we're going to compare the DSA, Europe's Digital Services Act, and how they're starting to regulate the online space in terms of behavior, and here in the UK, where we have the Online Safety Bill moving through Parliament, is that the Online Safety Bill has more child protection measures in the way that it's currently written. It's not a final bill yet because it hasn't fully passed Parliament yet. So I would point that out. And one of the key things that they have in there is on platforms in enforcing their own terms and conditions. And one of the key things is on age and forcing platforms to do some type of age verification. I think that's really interesting, and I'm really interested to see how that plays out, because we know 5 or so years ago, we had this idea of a porn ban in the UK that was totally unworkable. It was never going to work. It was basically selling porn companies your information because those were the ones who owned the age verification systems at the time. But now we've come back to this question about age verification. Is it workable? I do think it's a really important point, but also, is it pragmatic? If you have children or in your life, you probably know that if they're 13 and there's the platform that they need to be 14 on, and they ask you, oh, but all my friends are on it, can I get on it? Can I see what's happening? You're probably going to let them on it. You know, how much you should know what's happening and interact, or even know what the conversations are that are happening on that platform are really important questions. So I've raised a couple things in there, but these are all things that we have to grapple with. I think it comes back to, how are we going to regulate the tech space? And because it is something that moves a lot faster than anything that we've tried to regulate before, because culture moves, you know, communication moves. And it's global, as we've faced that challenge before. But I do think that we have to rethink our system of policy making at the heart of it.
Thank you. Alexei?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that I answered that question in the chat as well, with saying actually it's 2 questions. It's, will they try, and then will they succeed? I think they'll try. Whether they'll succeed, I can use the online harms bill as another example. Alongside the age verification, there is a clause which suggests that companies need to find a way effectively of being able to break encryption in order to be able to send information to the state as required. Now, a great article by Kieran Martin was written in the FT last week, saying that this is just going to be one of those bills that, if it passes, will never in fact be operated, because it's impossible. Particularly because about 2 weeks prior to that, the current global head of WhatsApp was asked what he would do if was effectively obliged to do this, and he said they'd simply pull out of the UK, because this is how technical governance actually works, is that you need to have a significant market share in order to be able to be a governing power in a global technology platform and a supply chain, which is why Europe did very well with GDPR. It's why it will likely do very well with DSA and its AI acts and others, because it has that bargaining power of user base. And that if these are the rules that all these countries and all these users are operating under, then companies are going to be obliged to do it, because otherwise they lose out on potentially huge profit margins. The UK going it alone is not that. And that's the problem, is that there is a disconnect between how policy has been previously done and allows for isolated states with less of a market share to still designate particular specific terms, and how that actually works in technology, which is global now. And I think there is a gap in understanding, a knowledge and education gap, which is being closed. The formation of DCIT, for example, as a standalone department, is a good way of seeing this. You just need to go on government hiring websites to see that they are frantically trying to gather the understanding and the knowledge and the expertise required to chart these complex waters. But as I'm sure many of you are aware, the problem that they then face is that they're asking or offering in the region of £30,000 to £40,000 a year for someone who is incredibly skilled and could likewise leverage the global market to do far better elsewhere. So there are there's all these different problems coming from different directions that are contributing to this divide between what they wish to achieve and a lack of understanding whether it is in fact achievable and what the moderate ground is. And I think that's the problem that we will face going forwards, that they might want to, whether it's possible, I don't think so.
Adam, I want to move on slightly in a second, but if you wanted to come, you've got your hands up, so.
Yeah, I'll make 2 quick points. I mean, just to back Lexi up, this whole encryption debate is well, it's ridiculous. But I think countries want to have data controllers in the UK make sure that they use end-to-end encryption if they're transferring personal data abroad, such as to America. But they want to make sure they can crack it all as well. I mean, I just don't know if this debate's ever going anywhere, but it's fundamentally tied into this digital sovereignty conversation. Interestingly, on the context of Splinternets, there was a proposal by China at the United Nations to add some kind of jurisdictional flag at the IP level of networking, so that network packets could be sent and would be limited to a particular jurisdiction, which I think is, personally, I think that's, in a lot of ways, that's exactly what we don't want. But if I'm dealing with personal data and I'm at risk of that being transferred abroad, maybe as a business owner, that is something I might want. There might be a utility for that. And then finally, I think just going to what Casey said about rethinking how we do policymaking. I mean, the approach that's been taken by Europe is to lean on European standardization organizations. And that is a different way of establishing technology policy, establishing standards that provide presumption of conformity rather than relying solely on how the law is written. And there's lots of pros and cons to that, but it is a different way that I think is quite interesting.
Thanks, Adam. If we move just to look back at the sociological impacts of TikTok, but also the wider kind of social media piece, one of the criticisms that seems to be laid at the door of maybe people critical of social media is that they rely heavily on more anecdotal evidence about harm, and it's not necessarily rooted in empirical evidence in terms of damage to, I don't know, children or vulnerable people. And I wondered if anybody got any insight on that in terms of what actually is out there. Do we need to beef up, do the people wanting to regulate the space need to beef up their evidence base?
Well, that's one of the key things that the online safety does do. So it empowers Ofcom as the regulator to require transparency reporting. So we hope that we will have a lot more of this information in the future. If we're looking at social media as a whole, instead of just at TikTok as one platform, and there probably have been a lot of reports out there, but the one that I know off the top of my head is one that Glitch did in partnership with a few other organizations, including the End Violence Against Women Coalition, and it gave us back results that you would expect it to, which is that women disproportionately face online violence, are victims of negative interactions online in a myriad of different ways, and people who have intersecting identities face even more. So, for example, what that means is that Black women tend to face even higher disproportionate amounts of abuse online. So that's a really key thing that is important that we bring into this discussion. Whenever we talk about a social media site, or, people love to say Twitter is the new public square, or they did at least before Elon Musk took over. I heard more of that then. But if that's what we're talking about, and a core debate around the online safety bill has been about freedom of expression versus this thing we started to refer to as legal but harmful. And one of the big pushes in the House of Lords that's still going on to amend the online safety bill is to include women and girls somewhere in the bill. And the last time that I had gone through the bill, women or girls had been mentioned twice. And so the way that we're starting to approach regulation doesn't really fit with the experiences of people and the harms that we can currently document that we know happen on platforms. If we're ever going to have a system that doesn't reproduce the inequalities that we're currently facing in our society, we're going to have something that is making us worse off in the end. And that's the system that we currently have. So I think that this discussion that we're having shows that there's a really good, big opportunity that we all need to grasp as we start talking about digital regulation and how that will happen. And maybe it's Adam's standardization point, but I'd be keen to know where's the public input into that? How do we get normal people to help make these decisions so that we can hear voices from everyone who is using these platforms and who wants to be engaging on these platforms, so that we're ensuring that we're creating spaces where everyone can do that.
Thanks, Casey. Alexei?
So as an ex-researcher who used to do a lot of Twitter analysis and data, my postdoc was on the role of social media and conflict escalation, and I had to download and code Donald Trump's tweets for 2 years, including all interactions with it, which was horrific as an experience, but it made me who I am. But what it also taught me a lot of was the difficulties as a researcher to actually engage with the content that you would need to make more than anecdotal evidence from the outside in. Most major platforms have some form of access availability. Meta used to have, to an extent, CrowdTangle, for example. Twitter did allow API access for researchers, which is now gone with the newest version of the API keys. CrowdTangle became increasingly degraded in terms of the amount of data that you could actually access from it. Others have been entirely empty and inaccessible for quite some time. So the first point to raise is the reason why you might have an experience that critical information has been anecdotal at best is because actually access to non-anecdotal data is incredibly difficult. There was a mention in the chat of some meta research that was done internally that was then leaked by a whistleblower that demonstrated that they had done their own research and discovered that effectively they were causing escalatory harm and in minority groups. I point to the case of Myanmar and Meta, for example, a demonstrable point where the social media platform actually escalated and caused significant harm to a minority community. So we know it happens. When their internal documents have been leaked, it's evidentiary. It's very hard to do independent work because of this lack of access, which is why the DSA includes that these platforms have to provide access to independent auditors and researchers, because if I'd been offered that as a researcher when I was doing it, it would have been a gold mine, and the amount of things that I could have done with it would have been incredible. It would Christmas come early every day of the week, but we never got it. Even when we're doing projects on, can your platform potentially lead to nuclear level escalation between states in the middle of conflict? And we couldn't get access to the API key. So that gives you the context for why the problem that we face. And in terms of is there a way to actually get the public kind of to have an idea of shaping these platforms? I'm a strong believer in multi-stakeholderism. I work for the ICRC these days. Like we're literally the multi-stakeholder when it comes to trying to do international humanitarian law around conflict. But it becomes a practical problem because you have to then somehow also educate the people using these platforms to understand the context of the decisions that they're putting into, because they're incredibly complicated. And it's also starting from a point of almost enforced lack of knowledge that actually helps these platforms grow, the fact that we don't understand how they work. So we need to fix that and then find a way of creating structures where people can actually have a hand in how governance and their interactions take place. There's a lot of work to be done effectively.
Thanks, Alexei. Adam?
Yeah, so I think coming back to the point of we need a new approach to tech policy and tech regulation, and building on Alexei's point that access is critical. For me, I think the solution around a lot of emerging technologies that have complex societal effects is what we call in the AI world sandboxes. It's regulatory sandboxes where regulators, academics, experts, technology providers, technology users, in my mind, in the ideal situation, a very multi-stakeholder engagement process is monitoring an operating system. Okay, some controlled way that technology can be explored rapidly by interested parties, and this can be turned into best practices and influence tech regulation and regulatory behavior. I just think that's the fastest way to get to regulatory learning. And Casey, answering your specific question, how do the public get a voice in standardization organizations? One way is through the BCS. One way is through the Trade Union Congress, and one way is through consumer organisations, which are funded by the European Union to participate. But that's not a lot of people. So, it needs a much, much broader participation from civic society. And it's a civic society organisations that want to get involved in standardisation, particularly in AI. Do give me a shout. I'm happy to help.
Thanks, Adam. We've kind of gone through the 47 minutes of the Policy Jam already, and I just want it's quite difficult to keep track of the questions being asked. I know the panelists are doing a great job of responding, but if anybody does want to ask a question, if they want to put their hands up, and then I can open the floor. I know I've seen some things from Lawrence and things from Darren, but if there is anybody that wants to ask a question of the panel, put your hands up and we'll go to that. But I want to just ask one question, which somebody has asked me directly around reciprocity and is it important? So should we be should the Western companies have access to Chinese markets, for example? Is reciprocity a red herring, or is it important? Should we be asking for the same treatment across the piece?
I'll start with that one. I think this is another one of those questions of would it be a good idea? And is it achievable? It's two questions in one again. Would it be a good idea? Yes, because growing up as I did in the 90s and noughties of the internet, the whole point was democratization of information through equal knowledge sharing, Aaron Schwartz-esque approach. And that would be a very good way to do so. I would say that perhaps we'd be not doing anyone any favors if we don't get our act together first with the way that our platforms are just as harmful in different ways. But yes, it should be. Whether it's achievable, that's a very different question. It's worth noting that, and this is not just to say China, but there are other jurisdictions that have very different concepts of standards of access, control, regulation, and oversight that simply are incompatible with these platforms as they currently exist. If you want examples of it, simply look at the history of platforms like Google Search and its relationship with China, and how it's had to negotiate the nature of its algorithm in terms of its data serving to search terms in China. But you can see this in other countries all over the world. Myanmar still, for example, India to an extent with its current processing of laws around social unrest and social media platforms and posts. There are Ethiopia, Eritrea. There are plenty of countries that effectively their governance structures as they exist now are incompatible with the technology and the platforms as they are. So yes, it would be good. Would it be something that would actually be achievable geopolitically? Unlikely.
Thanks, Alexi. Anybody else want to come in on that?
I'll change the question and answer a slightly different one, as always. I think it's interesting that we're talking about big social media companies and then looking at where they're coming from, right? Because almost all big tech companies, not exclusively, but most are coming out of the US and out of China, out of huge geopolitical superpowers, right? So I think this comes back to how can you enter the market right now? And then this brings us back to the digital regulation point. Is there a different way of regulating this space so that we can encourage more new entrants to join? Because instead of, looking at, let's say, what somebody's put, like Western governments are like, what a US social media site might look like versus what a Chinese social media site might look like, wouldn't it be great to have a woman-owned social media site? Or something that was started by someone in a different country, like that has a different viewpoint and wants to create a social media site where people can interact in a different way. I mean, personally, that's something that I would love to see. And so how do we get there? Maybe it's less about, the sort of us versus them dichotomy and more about there are very few privileged social media sites, and we saw TikTok rise very quickly. So I think people in their minds think that means that there can be new entrants, but at the end of the day, there is a lot of control in the current social media sites as they are. And so they're going to battle to keep that control, to keep the number of users. And so how can we maybe think about inspiring more people to be able to have different types of social media sites.
Thanks, Casey. Adam, Rashik, have you got anything to say on this?
Yeah, so I think I like what Lexi was going with there with the how do we foster greater innovation? I think that's an important aspect of this, and diversity is always good in driving that. I think there's another aspect here which is also professionalism, and do we need to do more to help those that are building the technologies be more professional and think through more of the potential impact of what they're doing. There are a whole range of societal issues where coming together could make a difference. We saw that during the pandemic when people were creating the food banks and making sure that people who couldn't go out could get food. Where there's a need, there's often a way, and some of the kind of social media needs can be both at a global scale but can be very hyper local. And actually creating something that allows you to do something really valuable at the hyperlocal level is incredibly valuable. And that might be some of the space that we see more innovation come.
Thanks. Adam, do you have something to say on this?
Yeah, I think there is I've been talking about technical standards a bit, but I think professional standards is a really important concept. And I think it's one that the BCS should be getting particularly behind in terms of new emerging technologies. What are the standards that we expect from technology professionals, regardless of the jurisdiction they're working in or where they're storing their data?
Thanks, Adam. Alexi, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just say on the how do we foster an environment where other competitors can come to market. First of all, if you take social media as a broader term than we normally do and stop applying it to just Meta, Twitter, TikTok, etc., social media is a vast ecosystem. And then if you look at that again, and it's very clear to see why there aren't diverse actors in this space. And it's the same reason why we don't have diverse telecoms companies, because they've all been bought by those originals. Who bought Skype? Microsoft did. Where did it come from? Estonia. It's a social media platform. If you want to see what happens is that a new idea comes to being, reaches a point where it becomes near viral itself, and then it gets bought out by Alphabet, Microsoft, Baidu, or any other of these now companies with large amounts of capital who are seeking to effectively maintain their space in there. So what do we need? Maybe what we also need is some more, coming back to global governance, but competition standards and actually non-monopoly standards that are actually applied and made to have bite, to the point that these massive companies can't just shrug off the fines, which is what tends to happen. A colleague of mine was bemoaning the fact that setting up a PC this morning for his mother using Windows 11 meant that they had to send data from the Philippines about their mother to the United States in order to turn on or install the operating system. Why? Well, because you've got two operating systems really for the modern user, Mac and Windows, that's it. And why is that? Well, because they bought out all the other competition and no one's going to use Linux unless maybe some people in this room. But that's the problems that we face, really, is that it's the fact that our market economy, our global market economy, is not set up to actually allow diversity of the marketplace. It lends itself to small, entities buying up small entities, and that's it.
Casey made a really good point in the chat about free market assumes there's fair access to the market, and Casey says not sure that we have that at the moment. I don't think anybody on the panel thinks that we necessarily have that. We have 4 minutes left. I just want to ask the question, what's next? And if we're thinking about kind of TikTok, we've talked about a lot of things, but if we go back to TikTok, and because this will continue to play out, I imagine, as an electoral issue and as something that there's a political hot potato. So what next? Any ideas? Rashik, you went on.
So I think the big thing here is we will see a greater increasing literacy amongst a larger group of people, because as Alexi said at the beginning, the unintended consequences are now becoming much more apparent, and people are now starting to need and want to understand more. I think that will get a groundswell of shift, but that will take time. It's not going to happen overnight. Governments can do what they want. The key thing is, what will the users do and how will the users react? That's the core of the challenge here.
Thanks. Adam, you're off mute.
I don't think the UK will do anything until they've finished the online safety bill. And I don't think the EU will do anything until they've finished implementing delegated acts to put the DSA in place. So probably not a lot, Dan. Probably just these legislative processes will happen. I don't think there'll be any big TikTok news until then.
Well, so there'll be saber rattling, right? It just maybe won't do anything. Okay, cool. Casey?
Yeah, on the online safety bill, like I agree with Adam's points, but I would say that Labour made an announcement that they would revisit the online safety bill to strengthen it if they win power at the next general election. We also know that the Digital Markets Unit bill is supposed to be coming out at some point soon-ish, and that answers to the digital competition side. And then what I would want to see, encapsulating a lot of the viewpoints that I made earlier, is I'd really love governments to think about how they can take a public health approach to online safety. And it's really important. So that takes into account, really building up expertise in this area, taking it really seriously, and also finding a way to bring the public along with them.
We've heard the public health model before from Victoria Baines actually around cyber. So there's some really good people talking about that, Casey. So we'll pick that up at another time. Alexi?
I'd agree with the pronouncement of what's going to happen specific to TikTok. I don't think we're going to see anything other than probably a more where governments do have direct control. So you'll see more statements of it being banned from government workers or civil servants, defence. You'll see that probably spread across the broadly aligned states. I know the French have mentioned it, the European bodies have as well. So that will probably continue. So that might be the headlines that keep cropping up for a while as all the others kind of come to that same page. But I agree. I don't think we're going to see anything specifically done until those who want to do something work out the how. And I'm not sure they've worked out the how yet. In terms of broader, and I think it's worth pushing this out to the broader perspective, is that you're right, Dan, that there's two major election periods coming up, and there are others across Europe in the same time frame, and I think that this isn't going to go away for that. And when I say this, I mean technology governance is becoming increasingly a thing that the general public are aware of as an issue. It's not a top line election issue by no means, but it is something which is raising up the public awareness. So I'd like to hope that means that political parties across the spectrum and across different countries begin to actually develop greater expertise and understanding and ability to build their credibility in this space to actually reach out to the public with a positive and useful message rather than one which is about some form of, I suppose, flag waving and etc. that we've seen in other cases.
Thanks, Alexi. I think you've just summarised all the key points that I wanted to make there. So you've done my job for me. Well done. I think that we've got no more time left. We're at 1 o'clock, but that did not feel like an hour to me. So thank you so much for all your contributions. Lots will come out of there. So the way that this normally works now is that Claire will write this up as a written piece that we will publish, and this will go online as well, so that you can watch it again and promote to your friends and colleagues. And we'll revisit some of this, because the point of asking the question about TikTok is that it opens up so many other things. And one of the things that's really fascinating is how, as the politicians become more literate around technology, so does technology become politicized in a way that it maybe hasn't, where we've had consensus across the parties for quite some time around a lot of technology policy. Things are going to change. So this is interesting. This general election and the US election is one to watch. Anyway, we'll be back. Thanks everybody for all your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks.